A man everyone thought had reached the end of the road spent his last money on a dead bus station no one wanted. They laughed at him, pitied him, and waited for the cold to finish what life had already broken. But beside him stood one loyal German shepherd, and together they saw something the whole town refused to see. What looked like ruin would soon become warmth, work, and dignity for the people the world had forgotten. And when jealousy, hatred, and danger came for that fragile light, the station would be tested in ways no one expected. So before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and please like and subscribe to the channel. Help us reach 1,000 followers so we can keep bringing you more meaningful stories. And now, let's begin this story. Morning came thin and pale over the northern edge of town, the kind of cold light that made every metal surface look more tired than it already was. Frost clung to fence wire, truck mirrors, and the bent rims of broken machinery behind the old agricultural repair yard where Silas rented a room no one else wanted. The room sat behind the main workshop, like an afterthought: one narrow bed, one chipped sink, a hot plate with one working burner, 2 stacked tool crates, and a window that rattled whenever the wind remembered it existed. Silas had lived in worse places. That was not a boast. It was simply the sort of fact a man collected after enough years of sleeping where he was told, waking when ordered, and learning not to expect walls to mean permanence. At 35, he had the hard, compact build of someone who had spent more of his life carrying weight than setting it down. He stood just over 6 feet, lean and strong without showiness, his body made for endurance rather than spectacle. His face was clean-shaven, the jaw square, the cheekbones clear under weather-burnished skin. His dark brown hair was cut short in the old military way, though now it had grown just slightly longer than regulation, as if civilian life had reached only that far into him, and no farther. His eyes were gray-blue, steady and unreadable at first glance, but if someone held his gaze too long, they might feel what many people did. A strange impression that he was looking at them without judgment, but not without knowledge. The discipline of the Navy had never really left him. It sat in the way he folded a blanket, in the way he lined his tools, in the way he checked a door twice before sleeping. Even hunger did not make him sloppy, while even loneliness did not make him noisy. On the floor near the bed, Rook lifted his head before Silas moved. The German shepherd was 6 years old, large without heaviness, with a working dog's frame and a sable coat washed in cream, gray, and black. His harness was black with a muted, deep red trim, scuffed at the edges from use. His ears came up first, then his amber-brown eyes opened fully, alert before the rest of him had bothered to wake. Rook had the expression of an animal who did not waste emotion where instinct would do. "You eat first," Silas muttered. He always said it the same way. Not tender, not rough, just certain. He scooped kibble into Rook's bowl, then counted the bills in his own wallet while the dog ate. The numbers did not improve by being counted twice. Rent due in 3 days. Truck gas low. Heating fuel nearly gone. One invoice from a roofing job still unpaid because the man who owed him kept saying next week with the cheerful honesty of a sinner who believed in mercy more than responsibility. Silas tucked the money back into the worn leather fold of the wallet and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He had enough left to survive a little longer if life stayed small. Life, however, almost never stayed small. By 7:30 he was out in the repair yard, welding a cracked feed gate for a rancher who complained about prices before thanking him, and complained again while paying cash. Silas did not mind that part. Complaining was a kind of weather. Men like that needed to make noise so they could hear themselves still mattered. He took the folded bills, put them away, and moved on to patching a rusted utility trailer. The torch hissed. The metal spat sparks. The wind carried the smell of iron and old grease through the yard. Around noon, the owner of the property, Hank Dauber, came to find him. What Hank was a broad-shouldered man in his 60s, with a red neck, a soft gut, and the apologetic face of someone who hated inconvenience only when it belonged to other people. "Silas," he said, rubbing the back of his head. "Got news." That phrase had never delivered anything good in Silas's experience. Hank looked past him, as if speaking directly would make the words more expensive. "The whole rear lot's been sold. Company out of Billings. They want the workshops, the storage sheds, the rooms in back. I can give you a little time, but not much." Silas set the welding mask down. "How much?" "End of the week." The answer sat between them like a shut door. Hank exhaled. "I know it's not much." Silas did not say what both men knew, that not much had become the governing unit of his life. Not much time, not much money, not much room, not much margin for error. "All right," he said. Hank seemed relieved, which told Silas more than any apology would have. But a man always relaxed when the bad news he brought did not turn into a scene. It was one of the quiet benefits of looking controlled. Other people mistook it for ease. He finished the trailer repair in silence. But after that, even the sound of the torch seemed different, thinner somehow, as if the day had developed a crack through it. That afternoon he drove into town for bolts, wire, and the cheapest coffee the general store sold. Main Street wore its usual tired dignity. Brick storefronts, a diner with fogged windows, a barber pole that still turned out of habit more than need, a bookstore with faded lettering. The sky overhead was bright, but the cold sharpened everything into outlines. Eliza Wren was out front of her bookstore, setting a crate of used paperbacks by the door when she saw him. She was in her early 60s, tall for her generation, with a long frame made elegant rather than fragile by age. Her silver-brown hair was twisted into a loose knot, and her face had the kind of fine lines that came from years of thinking before speaking. She looked like a woman who had long ago learned that pity was often lazier than kindness. "You look like a man measuring the distance to the edge," she said. Silas stopped. "Afternoon to you too." "That bad?" He gave a small shrug. "I've had better weeks." Elaborate, he rarely did, but Eliza had a way of asking that did not feel like prying. So he told her about the room behind the workshop, the sale, the end of the week. She listened with her hands tucked into the pockets of her wool coat. "There's that old station," she said finally. Silas's eyes moved toward the road east of town before he meant them to. He had driven past the abandoned bus station more than once. Every time, something in him had noticed it the way one scar recognized another. "The bus station?" he asked. Eliza nodded. "County still hasn't found anyone foolish enough to take it." "That's so." "I did not say it was a good idea," she said dryly, "and only that it exists." Rook, who had been sitting quietly beside Silas's leg, turned his head sharply at the word station. Then he rose, stepped toward the curb, and looked east, as if he could already smell the place through memory and wind. Eliza watched him. "Interesting dog." "He notices things. So do you." Silas looked toward the horizon, where the old road thinned and bent away. He had seen the station in all kinds of weather. Under summer dust, under cold rain, under winter sky the color of worn steel. A low 2-story structure, old passenger benches, a ticket counter, a back lot large enough to breathe in. Too much building for one man, too much trouble for a man with almost no money. And yet some part of him had already begun adding up what was still usable. Roof, counter, storage, a kitchen alcove, parking, proximity to the road, a place a stranger might stop, a place people could find. He hated that his mind was doing that. What it meant the decision had started before he was ready to admit it. About an hour later, he was standing in the county property office in front of Clara Dunn. She was 40-something, spare and exact, with straight brown hair tucked neatly behind one ear, and a face composed of angles that seemed sharpened by paperwork. Her blouse was crisp, her cardigan plain charcoal, her desk arranged with a precision that bordered on accusation. She had the look of a woman who trusted records more than recollections, and disliked both, unless they matched. "The station is not a normal sale," Clara said, sliding a folder toward him. "It's a conditional transfer of use, symbolic fee. Full responsibility passes to the recipient. Structural repairs at your cost. No commercial permit by default. No guaranteed residential approval. If you fail inspection within the allotted period, you lose standing." Silas read the pages. "How much?" She named the amount, as it was low enough to sound insulting and high enough to hurt. "That all?" he asked. "That is the transfer fee," Clara said. "Not the cost of making it livable, not the cost of keeping it warm, not the cost of learning you made a mistake." She meant it as warning, not mockery. That almost made it worse. Silas sat there a long time. He could feel the money in his pocket like a pulse. Nearly the last of it, enough, if kept, to drift for a while longer. Enough, if spent, to anchor himself to something broken and large and demanding. At the edge of the room, Rook had gone still, not sleeping, listening. Silas looked down at the dog, then at the window beyond Clara's desk, where the late afternoon light was turning colder. He thought of the room behind the workshop already lost to him. Thought of another rented corner, another week bought and sold. Thought of the station sitting out there with its dead windows and empty benches and all that wasted space. Not a shelter, exactly. A possibility. Dangerous, expensive, absurd, but possible. That was the part he could not ignore. "I'll take it," he said. Clara did not move at first. "You understand what you're signing?" "Yes." "Do you?" It was not really a question. He took the pen anyway. The ink looked thinner than it should have as he wrote his name. By the time he left the office, the key sat heavy in his palm. It was old brass, colder than it ought to have been. Eliza was across the street closing her crate of books when she saw him come out. "Well?" she asked. Silas held up the key. For the first time that day, something like surprise flickered through her face. Then it was gone. "You really did it." "Looks that way." She studied him for a moment. "Then I hope the place has been waiting for the right kind of fool." The station waited at the edge of town, under a sky whitening toward evening. Silas pulled into the cracked lot and cut the engine. The silence that followed was large enough to enter like a room. Frost glittered at the base of the concrete steps. What the old sign still hung crooked over the front. Letters faded, almost shy with age. He got out. Rook jumped down beside him. The building smelled faintly of cold brick, dust, and old weather. The front windows were clouded. The bench frames inside showed through like bones under skin. The whole place had the look of something that had once sent people onward, and now had nowhere left to go itself. Silas walked to the door. He stood there for a moment with the key between his fingers, and the evening wind lifting the edge of his worn olive-gray tactical shirt. Beneath it, the dark red thermal layer caught a trace of light. His old combat pants were faded at the knees. His boots were scratched and dull. Even his watch looked tired. Everything he owned seemed made of the same truth now. Used hard, kept longer than expected, still functioning, because no one had yet proven it impossible. He slid the key into the lock. When it turned, the sound was quieter than he expected. No triumph, no music, just metal surrendering to pressure. The door opened a few inches. Cold air breathed out from inside. Silas rested one hand on the edge of it and looked into the dimness beyond the counter. The shadows, the long silence, the shape of all that work waiting to take his money, his strength, maybe the rest of his luck. He knew, with the blunt clarity that had followed him through every bad decision he had ever survived, that he had not just bought a derelict station. He had spent the last safe portion of his life on a gamble large enough to ruin what remained of him. And still, he stepped forward. The first night inside the station did not feel like ownership. It felt like exposure. Silas slept in his jacket on the floor behind the old ticket counter, one arm folded beneath his head, the other close enough to the flashlight and wrench he had set beside him before lying down. Rook slept facing the front entrance, not curled, not fully resting, only arranged in a shape that could become motion in less than a second. The dog's breathing was slow, but his ears kept answering to sounds too small for the building itself to bother noticing the click of cooling metal, a dry scrape in the wall, wind touching loose glass somewhere high up. By dawn, cold had moved through the station like a patient thing with time to spare. It rose from the floor, slipped through the seams around the front doors, came down from the windows, and settled into Silas's shoulders, until he woke with his teeth clenched. For a moment he stared upward at the dark underside of the counter, and thought, with a private bitterness that almost made him laugh, that he had paid for this. Then he sat up. The station in morning light looked worse and better at the same time. Worse because daylight exposed every failure with honesty. Warped trim, grit in the corners, a long crack in one of the front panes, peeling paint around the waiting room benches, stains on the ceiling where old leaks had dried into maps. Better because light also revealed structure. The roof had not sagged. The counter still stood square. The back hallway still ran true. The building had been abandoned, not defeated. That mattered. Silas rose, rolled stiffness out of his neck, and studied the space as if it were terrain before movement. He did not think in broad, hopeful terms. Yet he broke survival into tasks. Seal the draft near the side door, clear one dry corner behind the counter, test the power lines, find whether any water still came through the pipes, make one part of the station livable before trying to rescue the rest. He fed Rook, drank coffee boiled in a dented tin pot over a small camp burner, and began. Dust lifted in pale sheets when he dragged ruined cardboard boxes out of the storage nook. Old ticket stubs, yellowed receipts, a broken desk fan, 2 rusted lanterns, a cracked bus timetable, and one dead mouse became a pile near the back exit. He wedged a warped panel over the worst gap under the front door, stuffed insulation scraps into a window frame, and used a screwdriver to pry open an old maintenance box in the wall. The wires inside were stiff, brittle in places, but not all dead. That surprised him less than it should have. Buildings held on in secret ways. But sometimes a line survived because no one had bothered to kill it properly. By noon, his hands smelled of rust, dust, and old plastic. A pale stripe of sun had moved across the floor and now cut through the waiting area, turning every floating particle into something visible and temporary. Rook, who had spent the morning pacing between rooms, stopped near the rear hallway and stood completely still. Silas glanced over. "What is it?" The German shepherd did not bark. He lowered his nose, drew in a long breath, then turned toward the back lot door. His body was alert, but not frightened. That meant recent scent. Oil, maybe. Human trace. Something not old enough to belong to the building itself. Silas walked to the back entrance and pushed the swollen door open. The lot beyond was cracked asphalt and pale winter grass, edged by a leaning chain-link fence. Tire marks cut through the frost-softened dirt near the side gate. Not sharp, not fresh, but newer than the rest of the station's abandonment. A vehicle had been there within the last few days. He crouched, touched the track, then looked up toward the road. Someone had come here. He filed the fact away without letting it grow larger than the work in front of him. Mystery did not keep a man warm. That afternoon, he drove into town for materials he could not salvage. Not much. Caulk, screws, 2 cheap fuses, a length of weather stripping, and a used extension cord from a second-hand shelf. The clerk at the hardware store rang him up with the flat curiosity of a man trying not to ask the question he clearly wanted to ask. By the time Silas stepped into Martha Keene's diner for coffee, the question had already reached Main Street ahead of him. Martha stood behind the counter refilling mugs. She was a broad-shouldered woman in her mid-50s, with strong wrists, a face quick with judgment, and hair the color of burnt chestnut pinned up in a no-nonsense knot. She moved like someone who had spent half her life carrying plates too hot for carelessness. Her eyes landed on Silas, on the dust ground into his sleeves, on the line of fatigue under his eyes, and sharpened. "So it's true," she said. "You took the station." Silas set a few bills on the counter. "Coffee. That is not a denial. It's also not your business." That got the smallest twitch from one corner of her mouth. Around him, a few men in work jackets kept eating while listening much too carefully. Martha poured the coffee. "You know that place eats money, right?" "I'm not feeding it much." One of the older men at the counter snorted. "You'll feed it all the same." Another said, without looking up from his eggs, "By first hard freeze, he'll be back sleeping in the truck." Martha slid the mug toward Silas. "I give you 3 weeks before you learn the difference between stubborn and stupid." Silas wrapped both hands around the heat. "I'll keep that in mind." He did not argue. He did not explain that he had not bought the station because he believed in miracles. He had bought it because rent was a hole, because drift was its own kind of death, and because even in ruin the place offered more possibilities than any one-room rental ever would. On his way out, Sheriff Nolan Pike was coming in. Nolan had the kind of presence that filled a doorway before the rest of him entered. He was in his early 50s, tall and broad through the chest, with a weather-lined face and close-cropped salt and pepper hair. His jaw stayed clean-shaven, but everything about him still suggested a man who had learned restraint through dealing with other people's bad decisions. His expression rarely softened all the way, though it sometimes approached fairness. Outside, under the pale brightness of the afternoon, he stopped Silas near the sidewalk. "I hear you moved in," Nolan said. "News travels fast." "In this town?" "Faster when it sounds like a mistake." Silas waited. Nolan shoved his hands into his coat pockets and looked toward the eastern road. That station's too exposed, too large, too cold, and too public. One man can disappear in a cabin. Harder to disappear in a place everyone can see failing. Good thing I'm not planning to disappear. Nolan studied him for a moment. People are already watching to see how long before you give up. Silas held the sheriff's gaze. Are you? I'm watching to see whether I'll have to pull your half-frozen body out of county property in January. The words should have sounded cruel, but they didn't. Nolan spoke the way some men nailed boards directly, because anything softer bent under weather. Silas nodded once. Then I'll try not to inconvenience you. Back at the station, he worked until the cold turned mean again. He patched the frame around the side entrance. He screwed old plywood over a broken lower panel in the utility room. He found that the kitchen tap coughed only air, but one pipe in the maintenance closet still sweated faintly when the line outside warmed in the afternoon sun. That meant the system was not entirely dead. At some point, near late afternoon, Pastor Reuben Hale arrived in a pickup that looked older than some marriages. Reuben was around 60, narrow-shouldered and long-faced, with deep lines at the corners of his mouth and tired brown eyes that still knew how to settle gently on another person without prying. He wore a dark coat polished by years rather than fashion, and his voice carried the patient steadiness of a man who had listened to grief in many forms and knew not all of it needed answering. Eliza told me where to find you, he said, stepping around a pile of rotten plaster near the front steps. And I had some things in storage. From the truck bed, he brought 2 blankets, an old thermos, a box of mismatched hand tools, and a portable work lamp with a dent in the side. Silas looked at the lamp. You selling? Reuben's smile was faint and tired. I am saving my church from the burden of pretending we will ever use these again. Rook walked once around the pastor, sniffed his coat, then sat. That dog approves people faster than most congregations do, Reuben said. He has standards. So should churches. Silas almost smiled. Almost. Reuben did not stay long. He only helped him carry the box inside and said, before leaving, a place does not have to look alive before it starts becoming one. The sentence stayed with Silas after the truck drove off. Near the middle of the afternoon, while he was crouched at the electrical panel testing one cracked switch after another, Rook made a low sound in his throat. Not warning, not fear, but insistence. Silas turned. The dog stood in front of the old ticket window, her eyes fixed not on the room beyond it, but on the narrow wall to the right, where layers of paint had bubbled and split over time. Sunlight hit the surface at an angle. In that slant of light, one section of wall showed a cleaner edge. Not large, no more than the width of a hand, as though something had once been removed or shifted there. Silas rose and walked over. He pressed his knuckles lightly against the plaster. Solid. Then farther right. Slightly hollow. Rook's gaze lifted to him, intense and unreadable in that animal way that sometimes felt older than language. Silas ran his thumb along the seam and found, beneath dirt and flaking paint, the faint outline of a panel not immediately visible from the room. He stood very still, not because of fear, because of recognition. Buildings kept secrets the way people did poorly, if anyone patient enough came close. He did not pry it open. Not yet. He had no light to spare, no time before dark, and no desire to chase curiosity before securing another night of sleep inside walls that still leaked cold like a wound. But something in him shifted all the same. The station was no longer only a burden with potential. It had become a thing with a withheld history. By dusk, he finally returned to the panel box. The first fuse failed immediately. The second held. He waited. Nothing. Then somewhere above him, from behind the counter and slightly to the left, a weak yellow bulb trembled to life. It was such a small light that under other circumstances no one would have called it beautiful. But in the dead station, against all that gray and dust and old neglect, it felt almost indecently alive. The ticket counter cast a tired shadow. The benches emerged from gloom. The floorboards near the front door glowed dull amber. Rook blinked at the bulb, then looked at Silas, as though this had been expected. Silas stood there with one hand still resting on the open fuse box, and feeling the ridiculous pressure of heat behind his ribs. Not hope, exactly. Hope was too expensive a word, but something adjacent to it, something made of proof. He had brought one piece of the station back. An hour later, while the sky outside turned cobalt and the windows darkened into mirrors, footsteps sounded on the front steps. Silas reached automatically for the wrench before realizing who stood beyond the glass. Edith Sloane had come alone, wrapped in a blue-gray wool coat and a burgundy scarf, the light from the ticket bulb reflected in her eyes. At 68, she was spare and upright, her silver hair pinned loosely at the back of her head. Her face held the fine, careful bones of a woman who had spent years speaking kindly to strangers while keeping her own deeper feelings folded inward. Time had lined her features, but had not thinned her dignity. She stood in the doorway after he opened it and looked past him, into the lit counter area, and with the expression of someone hearing a voice she had once known well, after believing it gone. "I saw it from the road," she said quietly. Silas stepped aside. Edith entered without ceremony, one gloved hand touching the edge of the ticket counter as she passed. Her fingers moved over the wood with something close to reverence, though her face remained composed. "This was where I sat," she murmured. "Winters, spring storms, tourists in summer, men late for the last bus, and acting like it was our fault the clock moved." Silas watched her take in the benches, the dust, the patched door, the single living bulb. "Not much yet." "No," Edith said, and now there was the faintest smile in her voice. "But it's not dead tonight." The words settled into the room and stayed there. She turned slowly, her gaze moving from the counter to the waiting benches to the narrow hall leading back into shadow. Rook came to stand beside her, and she lowered a hand without hesitation. He allowed her to touch the side of his neck. Outside, somewhere beyond the lot, an engine rolled by more slowly than necessary. Silas heard it. So did Rook. The dog's ears rose at once. But inside the station, beneath the hum of one old bulb fighting against the dark, Edith kept her hand on the counter and looked around as though the building itself had just taken its first breath in years. And for the first time since signing the transfer papers, Silas felt something sturdier than stubbornness take root. Not certainty, only the beginning of a reason to continue. The next morning, the station no longer felt like a ruin pretending at life. It felt like something more fragile and more dangerous than that. It felt like a beginning. Silas woke before the light had fully gathered at the windows. The bulb over the ticket counter was off again, but its memory remained in the room as tangibly as warmth lingers for a few seconds after a fire dies. Outside, the cold had a clean edge to it. Inside, the air still smelled of old dust, damp wood, and the faint metallic breath of wiring that had only recently remembered what it was made to do. Rook was already awake. The German shepherd stood near the entrance to the waiting area, his cream-gray-black coat touched by the first silver wash of dawn. He was not looking outside. He was watching Silas, ears pricked, body steady, as if waiting to see what shape the day would take before deciding how much of his own vigilance it would require. Silas pushed himself up from the folded blankets behind the counter and rolled his shoulders once. The cold had slept in the joints with him. He fed the dog, drank the last of yesterday's coffee reheated over the camp burner Pastor Reuben had helped him set up, and made a short list in his head. Water. Better heat. One room that could pass for safe. A way to make the station useful before the town decided it was only a spectacle. He stepped into the back corridor and listened. Old places always made themselves known through sound before sight pipes, ticking somewhere in the walls, a roof beam easing under temperature, a pane muttering softly in its frame. Nothing in the building sounded immediately fatal. That was more comfort than most things in his life had offered lately. By mid-morning, he had cleared a second patch of floor near the old office and stripped mildew-soft fabric from 2 waiting room chairs. He worked methodically, in that almost severe silence people often mistook for coldness. But Silas was not empty when he was quiet. He was listening inward and outward at once, measuring, correcting, storing small facts the way some men stored prayers. When he finished nailing a warped section of plywood over a gap near the back window, he heard tires in the lot. He straightened instinctively. Rook was at the front before Silas reached the doorway. The dog did not bark. He stood tall and still, weight shifted forward, the way he did when he had not yet decided whether something belonged to danger or merely uncertainty. The vehicle parked crookedly near the side of the building. It was an old sedan, with road dust crusted along the lower panels and one headlight cloudier than the other. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Yes, then the driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out slowly, as if every movement had to pass through a private calculation first. She was around 30, maybe a little younger, wrapped in a faded parka the color of storm water and old pine. She had the narrow, worn grace of someone who had gone too long without real rest. Her hair was dark brown and pulled back badly, as though it had been tied while driving, or crying, or both. Her skin was pale beneath the cold, but not delicately so. It had the drained color of a woman who had spent more time bracing herself than sleeping. She turned back toward the rear seat and leaned in. A little boy climbed out after her. He could not have been older than 5. Thin in the way small children become when their world has been too unstable for appetite, he wore a knit hat that sat slightly crooked over one ear and a coat too light for the northern cold. And his face had the solemnness children borrow when they learn too early that adults are not always stronger than fear. Silas did not move closer yet. The woman looked at him with the expression of someone already prepared to lie if that became necessary. "Our car just needs a few minutes," she said. "We'll be gone." The sentence came too fast, too polished in its false calm. Silas's gaze drifted once over the car, the back seat, the trunk that had not been opened, the child's shoes, the woman's hands. He saw a diaper bag, but no toy in sight. A travel mug with no lid. A blanket thrown over 2 small duffels. The rear license plate had mud caked over part of one corner in a way that looked accidental until a man learned how often fear learned to imitate accident. More telling than any of that was the child himself. The boy stayed very close to her leg, but kept watching the road instead of the station. And children waiting for someone to arrive usually look toward the person they've been told to trust. Children listening for someone they dread tend to watch the place danger might come from. Silas said, "Engine trouble?" Her chin lifted slightly, defensive by instinct. "I said we'll be gone." He nodded once. "Didn't ask you to leave." That seemed to unsettle her more than suspicion would have. Before either of them could say more, Another vehicle pulled into the lot. For one brief second, the woman flinched so hard it was almost invisible. But Silas saw it. So did Rook, who turned his head sharply, then relaxed a fraction when Edith Sloane stepped out of the passenger side of Pastor Reuben's pickup. Edith had changed into a darker coat than the day before and wrapped her burgundy scarf more tightly around her throat. Age had not softened her posture into frailty. She still moved with the quiet uprightness of a woman who had spent years seated behind a counter while keeping order through tone alone. Behind her, Reuben lifted a wooden crate from the truck bed. "Brought you a kettle, some cups, and a pot that doesn't leak," he called. Then he noticed the sedan, the woman, the child, and being the sort of man who understood the value of not forcing a wounded creature to explain itself. He said nothing else at first. Edith looked from Silas to the woman and the boy, and something in her face changed. Not pity. Recognition, perhaps, of a kind that passes wordlessly between women who have seen fear wearing good manners. "It's colder than it looks," Edith said gently to the woman. "The front room holds heat better now." The woman's mouth tightened. "We don't want trouble." "No one here is charging admission," Edith replied. The line might have sounded sharper from someone else. From her, it carried a dry kindness that asked for no gratitude. Silas stepped back from the entrance and held the door. For 3 full heartbeats, the woman did not move. Little boy looked up at her and whispered, "Mom?" Something in that single word broke the standoff more surely than any appeal could have. She took his hand and came inside. Her name, when she finally gave it, was Mara Quill. She said it as though offering only the minimum required by decency, and Silas did not press for more. He did not need to. Her face carried enough. Fine-boned, tired, watchful. A bruise fading yellow at the edge of one wrist. A habit of listening for engines. A way of standing near doors without seeming aware of it. While Edith set water to boil and Reuben carried in the crate, Mara sat on one of the cleaned benches with her son pressed close beside her. The boy's name was Caleb. He had soft brown hair that needed trimming and a face that would have looked cheerful under other circumstances. His eyes, though, were too careful. He watched Rook with awe and caution, the way children watched large animals when they wanted desperately to trust them. Rook approached slowly, lowered his head, and sat a short distance away. Caleb, after a long moment, smiled. It was a small smile, but in that station it changed the air more than the kettle beginning to sing. Silas spent the next hour making the front room safer without announcing that was what he was doing. He checked sight lines from the road, shifted a stack of crates to obscure the view from the cracked side window, moved Mara's car farther around back where it could not be seen from the main entrance, used a dirty tarp to break up the silhouette of the sedan in case anyone drove past too closely. He did these things with the same impersonal efficiency he once used to prepare temporary shelters in places where being found could turn fatal faster than being cold. Mara noticed. "You've done this before," she said quietly while Edith ladled hot water into cups. Silas did not answer the question exactly. "I know how people look when they're searching." Her gaze held on him for a second longer than before. Not trust? Not yet. But the beginning of a thought that trust might one day fit. By late afternoon, the station smelled of coffee, soup stock, and thawing wool. That change alone made it feel less like a property transfer and more like a place where human beings had a right to remain. It was then that Pastor Reuben brought Nora Bell. She came in muttering that the wind was rude and the station smelled like a memory no one had dusted properly. Nora was 74, short and sturdy, with a round face lined deep at the mouth, and eyes so sharp they seemed to belong in a younger woman. Her white hair was pinned back carelessly, and she wore a thick cardigan beneath a faded coat that had once been respectable and was now simply warm. One of her hands trembled slightly when she stood still, but when Reuben handed her the old kettle and pointed out the half-functional kitchen alcove, the tremor disappeared into purpose. So there is a stove," she said, inspecting the space. "An ugly one, but I have cooked on uglier." Mara looked up from where she sat with Caleb. Edith smiled under her breath. Nora ran her fingers over the counter edge, opened a cabinet, peered into the sink, and looked at Silas. "You planning to feed people in here, or just freeze them politely?" Silas folded his arms. "Depends what can be fed." Nora gave him a look that would have sent weaker men apologizing. "That means no one has thought ahead. I thought far enough to keep the roof over you, and now I will think the rest." There was no offense in her tone, only jurisdiction. For the first time that day, Silas felt something like the station shifting under its own idea of itself. Not physically, socially, humanly. One person sleeping in a ruin was survival. A former ticket clerk making coffee, a frightened mother resting on a bench, a child beginning to smile, and a 74-year-old woman evaluating the stove like a general reviewing troops that was the beginning of a system. By early evening, Nora had produced a thin but real soup from canned tomatoes, dried beans Reuben had brought, onion found in a supply sack, and a degree of confidence that bordered on holy arrogance. Edith arranged cups near the counter. Mara folded blankets. Caleb sat on the floor with Rook's leash looped carefully in one hand, though the dog had not moved an inch. A pickup slowed outside. Then another. Curiosity, Silas thought. Good. Curiosity spent money when judgment got bored. The first customer was a man in a quilted work jacket who claimed he had only stopped because his radiator light had come on, though his truck showed no sign of overheating. He bought 1 cup of coffee and stood too long staring around the station, as if trying to understand why the place felt less dead than rumor required. The second bought soup. By the time the sky had gone dark, Nora had 3 crumpled bills and a scatter of coins beside the pot. She did not touch them at first. She only looked. Then she sat down slowly in one of the waiting room chairs, wrapped both hands around her own cup, and said in a voice so quiet, Silas almost missed it. "Well, that's the first money I've made in 2 years that didn't come from someone trying to make me grateful for being old." Silas looked at her. The station was still cracked, underheated, and one failed pipe away from humiliating him. The town still thought he had dragged his last dollars into a grave with windows. But in that moment, with coins on the counter and steam rising from a pot Nora had bullied into usefulness, he saw something he had not allowed himself to picture too clearly. Not success. Use. The difference mattered. Later, after Reuben left and Edith said she would return in the morning, Martha Keene drove by slowly enough to be obvious. Her diner sat warm and crowded in town. She did not need to stop. She only needed to see. Through the front glass, she must have caught the glow of the light, the silhouette of Nora at the stove, the shape of Mara bending over her child, the dog stretched near the door like a dark guardian built from patience. She drove on. Inside, the station settled around its small, improbable life. And just before Silas banked the stove low for the night, Rook rose from Caleb's side and turned his head toward the old ticket wall, staring with such focused stillness that even Mara followed his gaze. Silas looked too. He could not yet see what the dog sensed. But the station, for one quiet second, seemed to hold its breath. By the end of the week, the station had developed a rhythm that was still too fragile to be called secure, but too real to be dismissed as luck. The mornings belonged to cold air, stiff fingers, and work that had to be done before thought could turn soft. The afternoons carried the smell of soup, sawdust, and brewed coffee into the waiting room. Evenings settled into a dim, human warmth that had not lived in that building for years. It was still a broken place. The floor near the rear office sloped more than Silas liked. One window in the side hall rattled no matter what he wedged into it. The stove Nora used had a temper that matched her own. But there were cups on the counter now. There were folded blankets. There was a row of hooks by the door with coats hanging from them, which made the station feel less like a shelter from weather and more like a place people might come back to. Silas noticed changes the way he noticed structural weakness, not emotionally at first, but through evidence. A spoon drying beside the sink. Mara's handwriting on a scrap of paper listing what they were low on. Caleb's knitted hat left on the bench because he no longer felt he had to keep every possession within reach of his small hands. Nora humming once under her breath when she thought no one was listening. He did not trust comfort completely. Comfort had a history of leaving without warning, but he had begun to trust use. And the station was becoming useful. On a gray morning thick with low cloud, Edith brought a man with her. Jonah Vale stepped out of Edith's old sedan with the reluctant stiffness of someone who had once been strong enough to make space for himself anywhere and now hated the fact that age forced him to negotiate with the world. He was around 72, tall enough that the bend in him looked like an insult rather than a natural curve, all ropey old sinew and bone. His hair was white and thin, cut short, as if he still did not believe in fuss. His face was long and weather-cut, with deep grooves from the nose to the corners of his mouth, and eyes that looked pale under heavy lids. He had no beard, only the stubborn gray shadow of a man who shaved irregularly because he had stopped seeing the point of impressing anyone. He carried a toolbox in one hand and a duffel in the other, and the way he held both said more about him than a full introduction might have. "This is not charity," Jonah said before either Silas or Edith could speak. Edith rolled her eyes with the tired affection of someone who had expected exactly that sentence. "Good morning to you too." Jonah ignored her. He looked over the station, then over Silas, measuring with the blunt suspicion of a man who had been diminished by too many polite people and had developed a talent for hating courtesy when it came wrapped around pity. "I heard there's work," he said. Silas leaned against the counter, arms folded. "Depends what you can still do." Jonah's mouth tightened, but some private approval flickered in his face. "Wood, repairs, small furniture, doors if they aren't twisted beyond decency." He lifted the toolbox slightly. Silas glanced at his hands. Big knuckles, flattened fingertips, half-moon scars along the thumb and forefinger. A carpenter's hands, even after years of less use. "Front bench is unstable," he said. "2 chairbacks are gone. Side door catches low." Jonah looked toward the waiting area, as if already taking measurements in his head. "You got scrap?" "Some." "Then I'll see if this place still deserves to stand." There was gratitude somewhere in the exchange, but it moved underground where neither man had to look at it directly. That was how Jonah stayed. He took the far corner of the old office for sleeping, and the first good hour of his first day to inspect every bench and door in the front room with a level of insulted concentration that would have been funny in a less tired man. He muttered to Woodgrain, clicked his tongue at loose joints, and ran his palms over surfaces the way some men checked a pulse. By noon, he had one bench turned upside down on the floor and a line of salvaged tools arranged beside him with military neatness that surprised Silas. "You ever serve?" Silas asked. Jonah snorted. "No. Raised 3 daughters, buried 1 wife, and paid taxes for 50 years. That enough discipline for you?" Silas nodded once. Fair answer. The station changed around Jonah almost immediately. He did not move fast, but he moved with certainty. A cracked chair became usable. At a table with a split leg stood level again. The front door stopped scraping. The difference between a place occupied by survivors and a place arranged by hands that respected structure was small to some people. To Silas, it was enormous. 3 days later, he found Eli Thorne in the back storage nook trying to steal a crate of canned food and a coil of electrical wire. The kid was halfway through the side door when Rook caught his scent and blocked the exit with perfect, silent timing. Eli froze. He was 17, maybe just, but hunger and bad sleep had stretched him into the narrow, unfinished shape of someone younger trying to impersonate hardness. He had long limbs, sharp shoulders, and a face still too close to boyhood to carry the bitterness he wore so naturally. His hair was a dirty blonde brown that had gone shaggy from neglect. A bruise colored one cheekbone in yellow-green remains. His hooded sweatshirt had once been dark blue, and was now only a washed-out memory of it. The denim jacket over it was too thin for the cold, and his boots had one lace replaced by knotted cord. He looked from Rook to Silas and lifted his chin the way cornered teenagers did when they had learned pride was easier to display than fear. "I wasn't taking much." "No," Silas said. "Just enough to come back for more if it worked." Eli shifted the crate lower in his grip. "You gonna call the sheriff?" Silas studied him for a moment. There was no calculation in the kid's hands. Not criminal calm, not real menace. Only desperation sharpened into attitude because that was the only kind of armor available to him. "No," Silas said. That answer landed harder than a threat would have. Eli blinked. "Then what?" "Set it down." The boy hesitated, then obeyed. Silas pointed toward the utility room. "You want to eat? Or you carry things instead of stealing them?" Eli stared. "That it?" "For now." The kid's face tightened again, but confusion had gotten into him. He was used to anger, used to being called useless, stupid, trouble, waste. Work in exchange for staying alive felt to him like something either crueler or kinder than he could classify. He did not trust it. That was not Silas's problem yet. By evening, Eli was hauling scrap wood from the back lot, sorting screws into old coffee tins, and pretending not to notice that Nora had handed him a bowl of soup, without asking whether he deserved it. He stayed too. The station did not become a community all at once. It became one through accumulation. One repaired hinge, one extra bowl, one coat drying by the stove, one person deciding not to leave at sundown. Caleb adapted first, because children often surrendered to safety before adults dared to. He followed Rook with solemn devotion, built bus routes out of bottle caps on the floor, and asked Jonah questions while the old man worked. Jonah answered, as though being bothered by a child was a personal offense against his concentration, but his hand slowed whenever Caleb came near, becoming more careful with tools. Mara remained cautious. Safety had reached her, but had not yet entered her deeply enough to become trust. She cleaned, folded, wrote lists, and learned where Silas kept the flashlight batteries and extra keys. She slept lightly, woke at engines, and always knew where Caleb was even when she appeared relaxed. Still, a little color had returned to her face. Her hair, when let down once while she washed it in the back room, fell darker and longer than Silas had realized, almost to the middle of her back. She caught him noticing and tied it up again with a speed that made him look away. At about the middle of that week, the station gave them something back. What rain moved in before dawn and stayed all day, a cold northern rain that found every weakness in wood and stone. Silas was moving a stack of old ledgers away from a damp patch behind the ticket wall when the moisture finally softened a strip of decorative paneling enough for part of it to peel loose under his hand. Rook was at his side before the board fully came away. Behind it was a narrow cavity no one had meant to be visible. The space was not large, just deep enough to hide a bundle of old papers, a cloth-wrapped ledger, and several envelopes tied with string gone brittle from age. Dust did not cover the contents evenly. Some of it had been disturbed long after the building was first abandoned. Silas did not speak. Neither did Mara, who had come up behind him with a towel over one shoulder. The dog stared into the opening with the same absolute focus he gave anything living and uncertain. But there was something else in the moment, too. Something stranger. The rain beat on the station roof. The waiting room smelled of wet wool and onion broth. Somewhere behind them, Nora was arguing with the stove in a voice low enough to be almost prayerful. And in the middle of all that ordinary survival, the wall had opened. Mara's voice, when it came, was barely above a breath. Maybe some places don't stay quiet because they're empty. Silas looked at her. She was not speaking mystically, only honestly. And honesty, in certain weather, could sound like faith. He took the papers to Clara Dunn the next morning. She met him at the county office wearing the same charcoal cardigan and the same expression of principled impatience. But when he set the old transit file and 2 transfer sheets on her desk, her face sharpened in a different way. "Where did you get these?" "In the station wall." That is not a sentence I enjoy hearing before noon. She put on her glasses and bent over the pages. Clara read like a woman who trusted ink the way some people trusted bloodlines. Her fingers moved lightly over the paper edges, never wasting motion. As she turned the second page, her jaw tightened. "These codes were reclassified," she said. "Meaning?" "Meaning the filing chain is wrong. This transfer stamp shouldn't sit on this route list, not unless someone moved categories after the station was shut." She looked up at him then, and the annoyance she usually wore around him had given way to something more interested and much less comfortable. "You need to keep anything else you find dry," she said, "and private." "Private from who?" Clara removed her glasses. "If I knew that, I would have told you already." It was the closest thing to partnership she had offered him. When Silas returned that afternoon, he found a black SUV parked near the front of the station. Adrian Krauth stood beside it. He was the sort of man who wore expensive restraint the way other men wore uniforms. In early 40s, tall, neatly built, dark hair clipped short, and combed with precision. A face so carefully maintained it almost seemed immune to weather. He had clean hands, polished shoes, and a dark wool coat that looked too costly to have ever absorbed grease or smoke. His features were handsome in a way that stopped just short of warmth. Nothing about him seemed improvised. He watched Silas approach with a faint smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "I've been hearing about this place," Adrian said. "That's so. An old station breathing again. Coffee, soup, repairs. Quite a revival." Inside, Nora's kettle hissed. Jonah's hammer knocked softly somewhere in the front room. Eli was muttering at a stripped screw. The sounds of work drifted through the doorway between them. Adrian glanced toward the building. "I'll be direct. I'm prepared to buy out your transfer interest." Silas looked at him without expression. "Why?" "It sits on a useful piece of land." "For what?" "Expansion, storage, and freight support. The county will modernize eventually. Some of us think ahead." Silas let the silence stay long enough to make Adrian fill it if he wanted. Adrian did not. Men like him rarely hurried to explain themselves to those they considered temporary. "How much?" Silas asked, not because he intended to sell, but because answers often revealed themselves in the shape of an offer. Adrian named a number generous enough to sound courteous, insulting enough to sound strategic. Silas almost smiled. "No," he said. Adrian did not frown. That was the interesting part. He only studied Silas a little longer, as if revising some private estimate. "You may find," he said, "that sentiment is expensive." "This isn't sentiment." "No?" Silas held his gaze. "It's use." For the first time, something colder moved through Adrian's face. Not anger, irritation. The irritation of the man discovering that another person had not accepted the role assigned to him. He adjusted one glove at the wrist. "Places like this don't usually come back. Maybe no one asked the right people to stay." Adrian's smile returned. Thinner now. "We'll see." He drove away without raising his voice, which made him more memorable, not less. That evening, after the soup had been served, and Caleb had finally fallen asleep with one hand buried in Rook's neck fur, Martha Keene slowed her truck in front of the station and looked in through the broad front windows. She saw more than she expected. Jonah at a work table, planing down a rough edge by lamplight. Eli carrying stacked bowls to the sink instead of running with them. Mara writing something in neat, careful columns near the counter. Nora standing broad and stubborn over her stove like a queen who had conquered by recipe. Edith in her old place near the ticket window, not selling tickets now, but still somehow keeping order. Us and Silas moving through all of it with that same spare, unspectacular control that had begun, against reason, to make the building seem steadier. Martha drove on. But for the first time, she did not look annoyed because he was failing. She looked unsettled because he wasn't. By the second week of December, the station had stopped looking like a stunt and started looking like a place with habits. That was when people became dangerous. Before that, the town had laughed easily. Laughter was cheap. It cost nothing to shake your head over a man spending what was left of his money on a dead bus station with a cracked roofline and a floor that still remembered every winter it had failed to matter. But now there was steam in the mornings rising from Nora Bell's kitchen corner. Now the front benches no longer wobbled when someone sat down. Now coffee cups went out full and came back ringed with use. Now the old place held the smell of soup, sawdust, mended fabric, wet wool, and iron filings from Jonah's repairs. It looked less like ruin and more like evidence. Silas had expected hardship, and he had not expected how quickly usefulness offended people who had already made peace with decay. He saw it in small ways first. A ranch hand who stopped for coffee, and then looked embarrassed to be seen enjoying it. A farmer's wife, who bought 2 jars of Nora's pickled beans, praised them warmly, and then lowered her voice as if she were confessing sin. Men who brought broken stools, cracked cupboard doors, bent hinges, old radios that hummed and clicked like sick insects, then acted as though they had only come to stare. The station never made much money. It made enough to count. That mattered more. Nora kept the crumpled bills in a metal tin by the stove, and recorded every coin in a lined notebook with an attention so exact it became a kind of devotion. She was 74, compact and broad through the middle, with a face that had gone soft only where years of feeding other people had made softness honorable. Her white hair was usually twisted into a loose knot that threatened collapse by noon, and when she stood still, one of her hands trembled slightly at the knuckles. But the tremor vanished the moment she reached for a spoon, a pot lid, a knife. In a kitchen, she moved with the stern grace of a woman who had spent half a lifetime proving that comfort was sometimes made from broth, onions, salt, and the refusal to stop. Jonah's corner by the side window had become a workshop of quiet resurrection. He repaired chairs, straightened legs on small tables, tightened joints in stools, and sanded rough boards until they looked ready to forgive the years that had split them. He worked in silence that was not truly silence at all. Small grunts, the scrape of wood on wood, the click of a plane blade, the dry rhythm of a man reasserting order one piece at a time. The lines in his face had not softened, but the old bitterness in his posture had. Being needed changed a spine. Eli ran messages, sorted hardware. He scrubbed soot off salvaged light fixtures, and learned to ask permission only after he had proven he could carry out what he was told. His body still had the raw, unfinished angularity of 17, all elbows and stubbornness, and his mouth was still quicker than his judgment. But the station had begun to sand down the worst edge of him. Hunger had made him sly. Work was making him visible. Mara sat more upright now. She still startled at certain sounds engines slowing too long. Heavy boots on the front step. A voice raised without warning. But her fear had lost some of its authority over her body. She had begun organizing the shelf by the counter where they kept soap, bandages, thread, and spare batteries. Her handwriting, careful and narrow, appeared more and more often around the station. Labels, lists, prices, reminders. Caleb no longer kept his shoes on indoors. That alone told Silas more about safety than any spoken thanks could have. Edith still drifted into her old place behind the ticket counter, as if some part of the station itself had been waiting for the exact shape of her shoulders to occupy that space again. She was 68, trim and upright, her silver-brown hair pinned with habitual precision, her face composed of small, delicate bones, and a reserve that felt neither cold nor distant. She had spent too many years managing departures to be impressed by surface emotion. She saw people more clearly when they tried not to be seen. And Silas moved through all of it in the same worn olive-gray tactical shirt, the same dark red thermal beneath, the same weather-faded combat pants and old boots that had long ago stopped promising comfort and settled for reliability. He repaired, lifted, sealed, organized, watched. He did not talk more than necessary. He did not smile often enough for the town's liking, but the station worked because he worked. And he was beginning to understand that this, more than the building itself, was what made certain people restless. Martha Keene came in on a Wednesday just before noon with the expression of a woman determined not to enjoy herself. She stood in the doorway for a second, taking in the room, the smell of lentil soup, the old bus benches refinished by Jonah's hands, the little row of repaired items near the wall waiting for pickup, the chalkboard Eli had hung crookedly but enthusiastically listing coffee, soup, small repairs in cramped block letters. Her broad frame filled the entrance. Her hair, a tired chestnut pinned back carelessly, had escaped around the temples. She was wearing her diner apron still, and the smell of bacon grease and black coffee came in with her. "So," she said, "you're a business now." Nora didn't look up from the stove. If you're here to sneer, at least buy something while doing it. Martha's mouth twitched. I'll have coffee. She drank it standing, as though sitting would have meant acknowledging the station had become somewhere a person might choose to remain for a while. Her gaze moved over the room and stopped on Jonah repairing a child sled runner with the intense dislike of imperfection that governed all his labor. That one yours? She asked Silas. No, he said. Kid from the Hanley place dropped it off this morning, Jonah answered without lifting his head. Broken doesn't mean buried. Something unreadable crossed Martha's face. She set down her empty cup and left $3 where the sign clearly said $1.50. At the far end of the room, Edith watched her go and said quietly, She's beginning to believe it. Silas was sorting bolts by size into labeled tins. Believe what? That the place may outlive everyone's opinion of it. He did not answer. Outliving opinion was not a form of victory he had ever trusted, but he filed the sentence away. The pressure shifted shape the next day. It began with an envelope slid under the front door before dawn. No return address. County paper. Inside was a notice. Preliminary safety review requested regarding unauthorized residential use and public access concerns. The wording was polite enough to sound inevitable. The timing was not. Silas read it twice. Then once more. Nora saw his face from across the stove. That's not a love letter. No. What is it? Someone wants the county looking harder. Jonah stopped sanding. Eli, who had been trying and failing to repair a stripped cabinet pull, looked up sharply. Mara went very still. Silas handed the letter to Edith first, then to Mara. He did not say what each of them was already thinking. If the station was judged unsafe too quickly, as all the fragile things taking root there could be uprooted in one sweep of official language. By noon came the second sign. 2 sheriff's deputies, not Nolan, but younger men with cold hands and apologetic eyes, arrived to ask a few questions. They were civil, even embarrassed. But questions asked in daylight inside a room where people had just begun to exhale always sounded like threats anyway. Silas answered evenly. Nora did not stop stirring her soup. Jonah worked the plane blade along a rough board with such pronounced calm that one deputy, after a glance at the old man's face, seemed to reconsider whatever comment he had been about to make. When the deputies left, Eli muttered, I should have taken the wire and run when I had the chance. Silas turned toward him. Then you'd still be exactly who everyone decided you were. The boy looked away, stung because the truth had landed without softness. That afternoon, Clara Dunn came herself. She stood near the counter in her charcoal coat, gloves tucked into one pocket, the winter wind still clinging to her shoulders. Up close, she always seemed carved from the same material as filing cabinets and courthouse steps. Hard, exact, not built for comfort. But there was unease in her today, and it sharpened her more than indifference did. I pulled what I could without creating a paper trail obvious enough to get noticed, she said. Silas took the folder she handed him. Inside were copies, property maps, route discontinuation notices, internal reclassification slips. What am I looking at? Clara's mouth thinned. A chain, not a full one. Enough to suggest that after the station was shut down, some parcels around it were shifted into categories that made later acquisition easier. By who? I can tell you who signed off on part of it. She tapped one of the pages. The name will not surprise you. Silas saw it. Crowth. Not Adrian. His father. At the station around him seemed to change temperature by a degree. That doesn't prove Adrian's involved, Mara said from the shelf she had been organizing. No, Clara replied. It proves the ground beneath your feet has a longer memory than this town likes to admit. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Even Eli, who barely understood land codes or county records, understood the weight in the room. Then Rook moved. He had been lying near Caleb with his head on his paws. Now he rose and crossed to Clara, not to sniff her hands or seek reassurance, but to stare at the folder in Silas's grip. His ears came forward, his body poised, not alarmed, alert. Then he turned his head toward the front windows. A black SUV had slowed outside. It did not stop this time. It rolled past the station at an easy pace, slow enough for everyone inside to know it was meant to be noticed. Clara watched it go. "Keep that folder hidden." She left before the light failed. That evening, though no one named it as such, Martha's Diner hosted a small town council listening session every few weeks, when the actual council room felt too formal for people's complaints. Silas did not usually attend anything like that. He had learned years ago that groups rarely improved a room. But Nolan stopped by the station at dusk and said, not unkindly, "If they're talking about your place, better you hear it with your own ears." So Silas went. The diner smelled of old fryer oil, wet boots, and irritation. Men and women sat with their coats still on, cups in hand, speaking with the confidence people adopted when their concerns were dressed as civic responsibility. Dale Mercer was there too, leaning against the wall near the pie case, with his thumbs hooked in his belt loops. He was around 48, square-jawed, broad in the gut now, with a barbered mustache and the polished ease of a man long accustomed to being thought useful. He ran a repair shop in town, the kind of place where people came for practical help and a little performance of neighborliness. His smile reached people faster than his sincerity did. He spoke before Silas had finished taking his seat. "I'm not saying the man means harm," Dale said, spreading his hands. "I'm saying intentions don't insulate walls or make a place zoned for families." A murmur of agreement. Another voice from the back. "There's a child out there." Martha, wiping down an already clean counter, said nothing. Dale continued, "And old folks, vulnerable people. You can't build a little kingdom of strays in a condemned shell and call it mercy." That landed. Silas felt every eye in the room slide toward him, measuring not just the station, but the man who had dared make one. He could have argued, could have listed repairs completed, benches restored, money earned honestly from soup and labor and mended goods, but could have said that half the people in the diner had already benefited from the very place they now called dangerous. Instead, he sat still, not because he was defeated, because he knew from old experience that some accusations did not shrink when answered. They had to be outlived. Nolan, from 2 stools down, finally said, "Then the inspection will tell us something useful." But the damage had already spread the way damage always did in small towns, person to person, cup to cup, certainty dressed up as concern. When Silas returned to the station that night, he found Eli waiting by the door, all awkward fury and shame. "I heard what Dale said," the boy muttered. "He says that stuff because if people bring things here, they won't bring them to him." Silas set the folder down on the counter. "Probably. You gonna do anything?" Silas looked at the room around him. Nora covering the soup pot, Jonah putting his tools away one by one, Mara lifting Caleb, half asleep, off a bench, Edith counting the day's money in the tin. "Yes," he said quietly. "I'm going to keep this place standing." It was not enough for Eli. It was exactly enough for Jonah, who glanced up once and then back down as if some verdict had just been reached. The sabotage came after midnight. Rook woke first, not barking but driving himself up from sleep with a force that slammed his claws against the wooden floor. Silas was awake instantly. There was a smell in the air that had not belonged there when he slept. Smoke. Not heavy yet. Thin. Sharp. New. He ran toward the stairs to the mezzanine storage level and saw it, the first gray braid of it slipping down through the railing slats, then thickening as it curled toward the ceiling light. "Up!" he shouted. Everything happened too fast and too clearly. Mara grabbing Caleb. Nora coughing but already reaching for water. Jonah moving with shocking speed for a 72-year-old man, dragging a bucket with one hand and kicking open the utility closet with the other. Eli scrambling for the extinguisher Silas had mounted only 2 days earlier because his instincts never trusted old buildings at night. Silas took the stairs 2 at a time. The fire had started near the stored papers, not large yet, but large enough. A determined blaze, fed by old, dry cardboard and ledgers that had waited years for a spark. He yanked down a burning crate, stamped at the edge of flame with his boot, then heard the hiss of the extinguisher below as Eli passed it up and Jonah cursed him into better aim. Smoke filled the mezzanine with a bitterness so strong it coated the tongue. Rook's barking now tore through the station in short, violent bursts, warning and panic braided into one sound. By the time the flames were down, the upper level was blackened, wet, and reeking. No one was dead. No one was even badly hurt. But as Silas stood in the darkened haze, water dripping from his sleeves and soot across the back of his hand, he looked at the scorched boards around the place where the papers had been stored, and understood with absolute cold clarity that this was no accident. Down below, the station still breathed, frightened, coughing, alive. And for the first time since he had signed his name and spent the last safe money in his pocket, Silas knew that someone had decided the building was no longer something to laugh at. It had become something worth burning. The fire left its smell behind. By morning, the mezzanine still breathed out a bitter mix of soaked paper, burned cardboard, ash, and old wood forced awake by heat. The station itself felt stunned, as if even the walls had not yet accepted how close they had come to losing everything that had begun to gather there. Silas moved through the damage with the same stripped-down calm he carried into every emergency. But under that calm, something harder had taken shape. A place could be mocked. A place could be doubted. A place could even be neglected for years. But fire meant intent. He stood at the foot of the stairs in the first gray light, one hand braced on the railing darkened by smoke. The boards above were wet and blackened in patches. Buckets, towels, and the half-spent extinguisher lay where they had been dropped after the worst of it was over. Behind him, the station was waking in pieces. Nora coughed near the stove. Mara's voice came low and steady from the waiting room, where she was helping Caleb back into his coat. Jonah muttered at a warped cabinet door, as if the morning itself had personally insulted him. Eli was outside with a shovel, scraping away the slushy ice left by the water they had hauled during the night, doing it too hard, too fast, as angry boys did everything when fear had nowhere else to go. Rook came to stand beside Silas. The German shepherd's sable coat cream, gray and black still, held the faint smell of smoke. His amber-brown eyes remained sharp, his posture tense in a quieter way now, not in panic, but in the sustained vigilance that followed danger once it had learned the shape of a place. He had not strayed far from the stairs since the fire. He kept glancing upward, then toward the front windows. as if his instincts had not yet decided whether the real threat had come from inside the building or outside it. Silas crouched and ran a hand once over the dog's neck. "You caught it early," he said. Rook's ears twitched. That was all. By 8 o'clock, Sheriff Nolan Pike arrived with one deputy and a face that looked older than it had the day before. He stepped into the station carrying cold air in with him and stopped near the front, taking in the soot, the wet boards, the exhausted people, the child sitting too quietly beside Mara, the black film of smoke staining the mezzanine rail. Nolan was a hard-faced man in his 50s, broad through the shoulders, his weathered skin drawn tight over the bones of a face built for seriousness rather than comfort. In some lights, his short-cropped salt-and-pepper hair made him seem more tired than stern. In others, more stern than tired. That morning, he looked like both. His eyes moved from the damage to Silas, and the usual guarded practicality in them had been joined by something more personal. Irritation, sharpened by concern. "You got lucky," he said. Silas shook his head once. "No, we got warned." Nolan's gaze slid briefly toward Rook. The deputy took notes, walked the mezzanine, asked routine questions with the stiff unease of someone who knew routine had become a thin word for what almost happened. Nolan himself did not pretend much. He studied the burn pattern, the papers that had been closest to the ignition point, the way the boxes had been stacked. "This didn't spread the way accidental fire usually spreads in a place this dry," he said at last. Mara looked up from where she sat with Caleb pressed against her side. For the first time in many days, the blood had gone out of her face again. Nolan noticed. He lowered his voice. "I'm not saying that officially yet. I'm saying you lock every entrance you can, and nobody stays alone." He stepped aside with Silas near the old ticket counter. The county's already on edge because of the notice," Nolan said. "Now there's fire. If this turns into a liability issue, they could shut the station down before anyone gets to argue about your intentions." Silas folded his arms. "Then we make it harder to shut. That's not how bureaucracy works." "No," Silas said. "But it's how survival works." Nolan held his gaze a moment. "You know what people are saying?" Silas did. That he'd brought this on himself. That the station was unsafe. That vulnerable people had no business sleeping under a roof one spark away from failure. That a man like him, too rigid, too private, too shaped by old service to be truly ordinary, could not be trusted to build something human out of wreckage. Nolan's jaw shifted slightly. "I can slow some things, not stop them." "Slow is enough," Silas said. It was not true, but it was useful. After Nolan left, the station worked because there was nothing else to do. Jonah rebuilt a shelf to replace the one half-charred on the mezzanine, his large veined hands steady over the wood as if age had only ever taken speed, never skill. Nora scrubbed soot from the kettle and began stock from bones and onions because her answer to disaster was always heat, salt, and something simmering. Mara rewashed every cup that had been out during the smoke. Edith inventoried what papers had survived. Eli fetched fresh boards from the back lot and tried very hard to hide the way his hands shook when he carried them. Silas climbed the mezzanine twice more with the surviving folders Clara had marked. The edges were damp, some pages ruined, but not all. Enough remained. Enough, if carefully dried, might still speak later. By late afternoon, the sky had lowered itself into a single sheet of iron. The cold changed first. As not merely stronger, but different thicker somehow, pressing against the windows instead of passing by them. Silas stepped outside to look east over the road and saw the horizon disappearing under a pale, moving wall. Snow not yet falling here, but coming. The kind that swallowed distance before it reached you. When he came back inside, Pastor Reuben Hale was just arriving with extra blankets from the church basement. Reuben's face, long and lined, seemed even quieter than usual in the gray light. He set the blankets down and looked once toward the windows. "That storm is turning ugly early," he said. "How early?" Mara asked. Reuben glanced at Silas before answering. "Soon enough that people should already be where they mean to spend the night." No one in the station said what followed naturally from that. Not everyone would be. Just after dusk, when the first snow had begun to hiss against the glass. As the station phone, an old wall-mounted unit Silas had repaired only enough to take occasional calls, rang once, stopped, then rang again. Edith was closest. She lifted the receiver, listened, then her face changed. "There's a vehicle out on Ridgecut," she said, hand covering the mouthpiece. 3 people. They slid off near the old turn. They can't get traction, and the woman says her husband's ankle may be broken. Silas took the receiver. The voice on the other end was thin with cold and discipline, the voice of someone trying not to panic because panic used energy, and energy was warmth. Behind her he could hear wind buffeting metal and the faint, high crying of a child too tired to cry properly. He asked location, landmarks, what they could see. Her answers came in broken pieces. A fallen signpost, a narrow split in the road, a drainage ditch half hidden under drift. When he hung up, no one needed explanation. The room itself had already changed around the fact of stranded people. Nora stopped stirring. Jonah set down the hammer. Mara tightened one hand around Caleb's shoulder. Even Eli, who still tried to wear recklessness like armor, looked very young. "Ridgecut is closed in bad snow," Edith said. "It is on the county map," Silas answered. He was already thinking in overlays. Not the public road, but the older route he had seen in the saved station files. An emergency bypass from years back, created before the newer plows changed the pattern of winter travel. Most of town had forgotten it, because most of town no longer needed to remember. Silas did not. He took the old route sheet from the folder he had dried by the stove the night before. The faded line curved around the ridge, dipped through a service track, and rejoined above the cut. Dangerous in weather. Still possible if the snow had not buried the markers completely. Nolan arrived 10 minutes later. Essay drawn by the same phone chain that carried trouble across small towns faster than news. He came in stamping snow off his boots, his coat shoulders already powdered white. "We've got a volunteer truck trying from the south," he said. "No contact yet." Silas laid the route sheet on the counter. Nolan's eyes narrowed. "Where'd you get that?" "The station archive. That bypass hasn't been used in years." "It still exists." Silence. The kind that came when practicality met the edge of necessity. Nolan looked from the map to the windows whitening by the minute, then to Silas. "You sure?" "No," Silas said. "I'm sure this is better than waiting for them to freeze." That was the truth of it. In military operations, in storms, in ruined lives, certainty was overrated. What mattered was whether one option held more death than the other. They moved fast after that. Nolan called in what he could. Silas threw rope, 2 wool blankets, a med kit, road flares, and a pry bar into the truck bed. Eli tried to volunteer before anyone asked. Jonah told him to shut up and carry the water thermoses instead. Mara packed dry socks and children's mittens. Nora filled a container with thick, hot broth and wrapped it in towels. Edith wrote the stranded family's description on a scrap pad for no reason practical at all, except that old habits of order sometimes held panic back from the edge. Rook was already at the door before Silas grabbed his coat. Caleb, who had gone quiet in the way frightened children do when adults become all movement and no softness, reached for the dog's harness. Rook paused long enough for the boy's fingers to brush the black strap trimmed in deep red, then looked up at Silas. "Bring them back," Caleb whispered. Something tightened in Mara's face. Jonah looked away. Nora made the sign of the cross with 2 quick fingers over the broth container before pretending she had merely adjusted the lid. Outside, the storm hit like thrown sand made of ice. As our visibility shrank at once, the world became headlights, wind, and instinct. Nolan rode in the passenger seat. Rook stood braced behind them, balanced with that powerful stillness only working dogs possessed. Every shift of terrain translated through muscle. The service track was barely there, more remembered than seen. Twice Nolan thought they'd lost it. Twice Silas found the shallow rise or depression the old map implied should exist beneath the snow. He drove by line, by terrain memory, by the logic of how a route had once been engineered through land that still held the bones of that decision. At one narrow bend, Rook barked once hard, urgent. Silas stopped. Ahead, buried under new snow, was the broken edge of a washout where the track had partially collapsed. 10 more feet, and they might have put the front wheels over it. Nolan let out a slow breath. "Your dog just saved us." "Again," Silas said. They found the stranded vehicle 20 minutes later, tilted at an angle in the ditch, passenger side half buried, hazard lights long dead. Inside were 3 people exactly as the woman had said. A man in his late 30s, jaw clenched white with pain. A woman maybe a little younger, sharp-faced and pale with determination. And between them in the back seat, a girl of about 7, wrapped in a coat too thin for the cold, but holding herself unnaturally still to prove she was brave. The man's ankle was already swelling badly. The child's hands were cold through her gloves. The woman was 1 good minute away from no longer being able to hide how frightened she was. Silas opened the rear door, and wind punched snow across the seat. "We've got you," he said. She looked at him the way drowning people looked at shore suspicious first, then desperate enough to believe in shapes. Getting them back took longer. The man could not bear weight. The child had to be carried part of the way wrapped inside one of Nora's blankets. And the woman insisted on helping until her own balance nearly went under her. Rook ranged ahead and back, never far, checking the track in sweeps of motion that seemed almost white against the storm. More than once, Silas caught the shape of the dog only by the deep red trim of the harness flickering in the truck lights like a small ember refusing to go out. When they finally reached the station again, it looked impossible. Light in the windows, smoke from the flue. The front doors opened just enough for help to move in and out, figures waiting. Inside, the waiting room had transformed. Nora had the stove roaring and soup ladled before the family could fully speak. Mara and Edith moved with practiced efficiency. Coats off, blankets on, wet gloves replaced, names taken, water given. Jonah had set 2 benches together and braced them into a makeshift resting platform. Eli carried in extra wood and did not drop a single armload. Caleb stood off to the side beside Rook, solemn as a witness. For one suspended moment, no one said anything. Not because there were no words, because the room itself said enough. This place they had called unstable, foolish, temporary, dangerous. This place held heat now, held order, held hands that knew what to do. Nolan saw it. So did the county inspector who, summoned by the fire report and the safety complaint earlier that day, arrived just as the rescued family was being settled. He was a narrow, middle-aged man in a gray county coat, spectacles fogged from cold, clipboard under one arm like a shield against human complication. His face had the prematurely tired look of men who spent too long telling buildings what they failed to be. But when he stepped through the doors and saw the child asleep under a blanket, the injured man splinted and fed, the old station bright with work and purpose, something in his expression faltered. He did not speak immediately. Neither did Silas. The storm hammered the windows. The kettle rattled softly on the stove. Somewhere near the door, Rook lay down at last, head on paws, eyes still open. The inspector took off his glasses, wiped them, and looked around again as if he had expected a wreck, and instead found a mechanism, imperfect, improvised, but alive. Nobody needed to explain what the station had become for that one night. It was the only place within miles that had been ready when readiness mattered. Morning came after the storm, with the kind of brightness that belonged only to places that had survived the night by a margin no one wanted to measure too closely. The snow outside the station was blinding where the first hard light struck it. Every drift edged in silver, every buried fence line made to look almost clean. But inside, the truth of the night remained in the small signs people trusted more than beauty. Wet gloves drying near the stove, boots lined by the door in no particular order, the sharp, medicinal smell of the splint on the rescued man's leg, half-drunk cups of coffee gone cold on the counter, and the deep exhaustion that made everyone move more slowly, more carefully, as if their bones had not yet agreed that danger was over. Silas had not slept. He had sat in a straight-backed chair near the front windows until dawn, his old military watch catching the stove light whenever he checked the hour without needing to. The olive-gray tactical shirt he wore under his coat still smelled faintly of smoke beneath the newer smell of snow and cold air. His dark brown hair, cut short in the old, disciplined way, had dried into slight disorder at the crown after the storm. His jaw showed the tightness of fatigue, his face clean-shaven, and set in that same controlled stillness that made strangers think he was harder than he was. But the skin under his eyes had gone darker. His shoulders held more weight than his body should have been asked to carry. Only his eyes stayed unchanged, gray-blue, clear, unblinking, looking at the station and everyone inside it with the same alert, unjudging steadiness that had made people uneasy before it made them trust him. Rook lay near the door, not sleeping either. Was the German shepherd's cream-gray-black coat had dried in rough ripples after the storm. His black harness, trimmed with deep muted red, still bore a line of salt where meltwater had dried against the strap. He lifted his head whenever someone moved, his amber-brown eyes watchful without being anxious. He had guarded the station through fire, through wind, through the long hours after rescue, and now he seemed to understand that the building had crossed into some new territory of danger, less visible perhaps, but no less real. The rescued family remained in the waiting room through the morning. The husband, a thick-boned man in his late 30s named Aaron Lusk, lay on the makeshift bench arrangement Jonah had built. Aaron had the rough hands of someone used to engines or heavy farm equipment, and the kind of face weather carved deeper each year rather than softening. His jaw was dark with overnight stubble. His dark hair flattened on one side, and pain had made his patience thinner than his pride preferred. Beside him, his wife Taryn moved with that brittle competence some women carried when panic had been postponed too long to be indulged. She was slight and long-limbed, her cheeks hollowed by cold and worry. Her blonde hair escaped from the band she had tied it with. Their daughter, Lucy, 7 years old and narrow as a reed under all her blankets, had fallen asleep at last with one mitten still on and one hand tucked under her chin. In sleep, children always looked younger than fear had made them. Nora kept broth on the stove and refused all praise with active hostility. Edith folded towels and moved among the room's edges with the quiet assurance of someone who had once kept order in a place people passed through every day without noticing how much invisible labor held them there. Mara washed mugs, reorganized shelves, rewrote a list that did not need rewriting simply because her hands needed work if her mind was to stay out of darker rooms. Jonah inspected every damp board near the front steps and muttered to himself about swelling wood and bad weather. Eli, red-eyed from too little sleep, carried ash buckets outside and brought in more chopped wood without being asked. Caleb followed Rook until both of them seemed to have accepted the arrangement. The county inspector returned just before 10. This time he did not arrive looking merely inconvenienced by human complication. He stepped out of the county sedan with the careful stiffness of a man who knew. He had seen something the night before that had unsettled his categories. He was medium height, thin at the shoulders, with a narrow face and pale, thinning hair combed too carefully across the top. His spectacles gave him an air of someone who trusted forms over intuition, but the storm had forced him to witness something forms did not explain. Warmth, order, rescue, competence was all produced inside a place his clipboard had prepared him to mark as unsuitable. He stood inside the doorway for a long moment before speaking. "I need to inspect the downstairs safety points again," he said. Nolan Pike came in behind him, carrying cold air and a more exhausted expression than usual. He gave Silas a brief nod that held no friendliness, but something weightier, now respect, unwillingly confirmed by evidence. The sheriff's coat was still salt-stained at the hem. His broad face showed the strain of a night spent balancing official duty against the old fact that people froze faster than county procedure moved. Silas showed the inspector the mounted extinguisher, the repaired latch, the cleared front path, the stove area Nora kept cleaner than any law required, the sleeping arrangement that had been improvised with more common sense than some properly funded shelters ever managed. The inspector took notes, but with each room his expression became less certain in the direction he had originally intended. At the counter, he set down his clipboard for a moment and looked not at the building, but at the people. Nora refilling a bowl for Aaron without asking whether he wanted more. Jonah shaving a rough edge off a plank, so Lucy would not catch a glove on it later. Mara kneeling to tie Caleb's bootlaces because his fingers were still clumsy with cold. Edith taking names and needs in a lined notebook, with the old courtesy of someone who believed record-keeping itself could be humane. Eli carrying out melted slush with both arms straining, refusing help because being useful had become precious to him. Rook stretched across the threshold like a living answer to the word vigilance. Silas in the middle of it all, not claiming authority with speeches, but holding every moving part in a kind of invisible order. The inspector lifted the clipboard again. "There will still need to be conditions," he said at last. Silas nodded. "There already are?" It was the sort of answer that might once have sounded defiant. Now it only sounded true. By noon, word had begun to travel. Not rumor in its usual poisonous form. Not exactly. something more disruptive than rumor. Witness. The family rescued from Ridgecut had been seen brought back through the storm. The county inspector had been seen entering and not immediately shutting the place down. Nolan had been seen staying longer than courtesy required. In a town that made decisions about reality by the slow accretion of what people glimpsed from trucks, diner windows, church steps, and feed stores, this mattered. Martha Keene arrived carrying a pot so large that Eli nearly ran to help before remembering pride and slowing himself deliberately. She came through the front door with cheeks reddened by the cold, chestnut hair breaking loose from its pins, and the rigid expression of a woman who had spent all morning arguing with herself and lost. The heavy stock pot she carried steamed through the lid. "I made stew," she said to no one in particular. Then, as seeing the room go quiet around her, she added almost angrily, "My lunch crowd eats less when roads are bad." Nora looked up from the stove, took in the pot, and sniffed. "Too much time." Martha's eyes narrowed. "Still food." Nora considered, then gave one short nod. "Set it there." That was all. No apology, no dramatic conversion. Yet the whole room understood the weight of the moment. Martha, whose voice had carried more skepticism than most, had walked into the station carrying heat. Not from a revelation shouted aloud, but from something smaller and stranger. When Martha set the pot down, Rook, who had tolerated nearly everyone but truly trusted very few rows from near the door, walked to her and rested his chin briefly against the side of her thigh before returning to his post. Martha froze. For 1 second, the sharp-tongued woman who had mocked Silas from behind diner coffee was replaced by someone much younger. Someone surprised to be recognized by kindness she had not earned in advance. Her hand hovered uncertainly above the dog's head. She did not touch him, but her face changed. Not softened exactly, opened. "I thought," she said, still looking at the place where Rook had stood, "you were burying your money in this heap of iron." Silas met her eyes. Martha's voice lowered. "Looks more like you were building people back up." No one answered immediately. The station itself seemed to hold the words for a moment, letting them settle into the wood, the cups, the steam, the tired bodies. Later that afternoon, Clara Dunn arrived with documents in a weatherproof portfolio clutched to her chest. She moved quickly, as if reluctant to be seen at the station longer than necessary, but there was something sharpened in her face beyond her usual severity. Clara had the kind of beauty some people missed because it came wrapped in discipline. Straight brown hair pulled back cleanly, fine angular features, intelligent dark eyes behind narrow glasses, and a mouth that rarely smiled but often tightened around truths she did not enjoy delivering. She stepped out of her coat near the counter and spread the copies on the table Jonah had repaired 3 days ago. "I shouldn't technically have all of this yet," she said. Silas looked down. Parcel revisions. Correspondence. Internal notes. A record of delayed county reviews. One signature chained to another over years. Not enough to blow open the entire history of the station, but enough to stitch together the outline of a pattern. The land around the station had not simply decayed into availability. It had been eased, nudged, classified, and forgotten in useful ways. Nolan, who had stayed longer than official presence demanded, read over Silas's shoulder. His jaw hardened. "Crowth," he said. "Family network, at least," Clara corrected. "Possibly more. I am not saying what can't yet be proved, and I'm saying the timing of what happened to this station and what happened around it is no coincidence. Adrian did not come in person. He sent his lawyer first. The woman arrived close to dusk in a black sedan, far too polished for the slush outside. She was not from town. That was obvious in the precision of her coat, the cut of her boots, the smoothness with which she carried herself over ice without once looking down. She introduced herself as Marlene Voss, counsel for development interests associated with Crowth Logistics. She was in her late 40s, tall and elegantly spare, with dark hair pinned into a severe knot and a face composed like fine glass, refined, careful, and sharp enough to cut on contact. Her makeup was minimal, her tone courteous, her eyes entirely transactional. She listened while Silas refused her first offer. Then she listened while Clara asked, very softly, whether Crowth Logistics routinely sent counsel before county review was complete. Yet Marlene's smile changed almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Crowth is merely concerned about safety," she said. Nora laughed aloud from the stove. It was not a pleasant sound. Men like him always discover concern when poor people stop dying quietly. Marlene did not dignify the remark with response. But when she left, she did so knowing the station had become more dangerous to her employer than a simple property dispute. It had become visible. That evening, after the rescued family had been taken by relatives and the day's last pot had been scraped nearly clean, Silas stepped out onto the front steps alone. The storm had passed. The sky above the station was black and clear, stars hard as nailheads. Snowbanks shone faintly under moonlight. The road was quiet in the rare, complete way only winter could enforce. He stood with his hands shoved into his jacket pockets, feeling fatigue in every joint. Behind him, through the glass, he could see movement softened by light. Nora wiping down the stove, Jonah stacking tools, Mara lifting Caleb half asleep from a chair, Edith counting the day's money into the tin, Eli carrying in the signboard from outside. Rook pushed through the door and came to stand beside him. For a while they said nothing to each other, man and dog, both of them more comfortable in loyalty than in language. Silas had not built anything permanent. Not yet. The county had only granted time, conditions, inspection points, space enough for a future, if the future could be defended. Adrian still had money, law, and old influence. The station still had cold, weak points, and too many people inside it whose hope had only recently become visible enough to be wounded. But tonight, the building stood. Not as a joke, not as a mistake, not even merely as a shelter. It stood as proof. Proof that usefulness could grow where contempt had once settled. Proof that old hands still knew how to mend. Proof that a child could sleep more deeply in a room others had called unfit. A proof that warmth, labor, and order could change the argument before words ever did. Proof that a place meant for departures could become the one place people arrived still needing to be saved. Rook leaned briefly against Silas's leg, solid and warm. Silas looked back through the window one more time at the people inside that battered station, every one of them carrying some old fracture the world had once mistaken for final ruin. Then he opened the door and went back in. Sometimes God does not send a miracle the way people expect. He does not always part the storm at once, and he does not always place a perfect answer in our hands. Sometimes he sends a tired man, a broken place, a faithful dog, and one last chance to choose kindness when the world has already turned away. What looked like an abandoned station became a home. What looked like useless hands became hands that saved, repaired, cooked, carried, and comforted. And maybe that is how God still works in everyday life, through people who refuse to let the cold have the final word, through small acts of mercy, through doors that stay open when they could have been shut. In our own lives, we may not be called to rescue a station in the snow, But we are all given moments when someone around us is tired, forgotten, ashamed, grieving, or silently asking for help. Sometimes the miracle is not in doing something grand. Sometimes the miracle is simply becoming a little light, a little warmth, a little shelter for someone who thought no one would come. So if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, or tell us what part of this story stayed with you. And if you believe in stories of faith, mercy, healing, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel and walk with us on this journey. May God bless every person watching. May He bring peace to the troubled, strength to the weary, healing to the hurting, and hope to every home that feels cold tonight. And may He remind you that even in the hardest season of life, His light still knows how to find the forgotten.